Now viewers, let me introduce you to a dialogue between Socrates and his disciple in this session. Well, it is an interesting thing which helps you to understand different interesting facets of life. And you will also learn more about this Socratic dialogue. It is called as Meno, and how exactly the life is full of these virtues, the different interesting facets which gives you information more in the coming modules. In this session attempts to determine the definition of virtue in general. The dialogue has two major participants, Socrates and Meno, a minor participant, Anytus. So, this whole session, it revolves around three characters or three people or three speakers. It is an interesting sequence of dialogues that ends with the realization among the participants that none of them knows the actual meaning of virtue. Plato was born in a prominent family in the year 427 BC in Athens, which is in Greece. He was the disciple of Socrates, an enigmatic figure and a great philosopher. Plato was a mathematician and a writer of philosophical dialogues on various topics like politics, rhetoric, philosophy, knowledge, wisdom, and many other interesting areas of knowledge. He started an educational academy in Athens, which became a seat of knowledge and philosophy in the Western world. In a short period of time, the academy came into limelight and pupils started coming from all over the world to learn philosophy. Not only philosophy, politics, economics, mathematics, logic, rhetoric, etc. One of the prominent disciples of this academy was Aristotle, who later became the political guru of Alexander the Great. The credit for Plato's philosophical excellence goes to Socrates, who taught him the fundamentals of philosophy, mathematics, politics, logics, ethics, and so on. Plato's Socratic dialogues are famous all over the world. 36 dialogues and 13 letters are ascribed to his name, which basically houses his complete philosophical exercises in his life. The details of these are as follows. Well, early dialogues were Apology of Socrates, Crito, Ion, Lysis, etc. Early transitional dialogues, Cratylus, Gorgias, Meno, Phaedo, Protagoras, Symposium, etc. Middle dialogues, Republic, Phaedrus, Parmenides, Theaetetus, etc. The last category of the dialogues which he wrote was called later dialogues, which included Critias, Sophist, Statesman, Laws, Philebus, etc. There are a few more dialogues which are credited to Plato, but there is no evidence available for such credentials. Almost all the dialogues are highly influenced by his teacher, Socrates, and his philosophy of life. Plato wrote these dialogues as a mature philosopher, but never came into the picture directly as the author or mentioned the name of Plato. His ideas, thought and dialogues are expressed through his mouthpiece, Socrates, who is the protagonist of these series of dialogues. Many of the views expressed in these dialogues are mainly that of Plato and the historical figure Socrates. So, you see, the credit goes to two main figures, they are Socrates and Plato. All the dialogues mark certain influence of Socrates on the ideas and views presented in the form of dialogues. Meno is a character who raises some doubts and Socrates answers the queries. That is how the dialogue continues. Here Socrates is the mouthpiece of Plato. The ideas, views and philosophical implications presented are that of Plato himself. Socrates taught Plato the intellectual humility of recognizing that our supposed wisdom amounts nothing when carefully scrutinized. Now, there are certain abstract things that are discussed in this session in the form of a dialogue. So, I expect you to be little attentive and keep on analyzing them carefully as I present them to you. This is the perpetual ideological influence of Socrates on Plato's dialogues on variety of topics. Now, this shows Socrates has a very powerful influence on Plato. Such a prolific dialogue writer, philosopher and great universal mentor died in Athens at the age of 80, that is in 347 BC, by leaving his intellectual legacy for the world of literature. The Western world will be and always be indebted to these great philosophers and thinkers of the Greek world. Plato's Meno is a sequence of dialogues which was written during the transitional period, so it is called the transitional Socratic dialogue, which was written in about 402 BC. The dialogue begins with Meno asking Socrates whether virtue can be taught. It is an elaborate dialogue on this topic between the two, and it occupies the entire text. Socrates and Meno exercise together to interrupt the concept of virtue and try to conclude whether it can really be taught or not. They intend to seek information from other experts. They have their own opinions about this and always draw their own conclusions. By the end of the dialogue, Socrates, Meno and Anytus arrive at the classic state of Socratic aphoria or perplexity. It is such a state of mind when none of the participants understand the actual meaning of virtue. Ultimately, they realize that they really do not know what virtue is all about. This also shows how complicated it is to understand the concept of virtue in simple terms. Plato did not present himself as a participant in any of his dialogues except in the Apology of Socrates. Some dialogues like Meno, Crito, Phaedrus, Gorgias, etc. have no narrator. So, they are purely dramatic in form. Some dialogues such as Lysis, Republic, Charmides, etc. have Socrates as the narrator, wherein he speaks in the first person, that is using I. The present dialogue, Meno, is in a dramatic form and has three participants. Who are they? Meno, Socrates and Anytus. Meno asks the question about virtue and Socrates answers the question based on his own perspectives, and Anytus gives some inputs on the topic, but the fact is none of them really know the actual meaning of virtue. Great thinkers and philosophers are together, yet they are unable to decide what virtue is exactly all about. Plato's Meno is a dialogue among three different characters who talk about virtue. It is presented in interactive question-answer dialogue form. So, when there is an interactive session, many discussions come out. Discussions become interesting. Sometimes we also arrive at the right solution. Socrates is the central character and the mouthpiece of Plato. Historically, Socrates was a great philosopher of Athens. He had no fortune but many followers. His philosophy of life, human existence and politics had certain influence on the other people of his time. He dedicated his life to educate people that they were not wise and ignorant of so many things in the world. He also used oratorical skills to encourage them to discover truth and have true opinions in life. There was a great quest in people in those days to understand what exactly knowledge means, how to understand life, how to understand abstract things like virtue and knowledge. He trusted wisdom throughout his life and shared his knowledge and experience with the people of his time. Socrates and his company had something to share on various subjects like politics, art, religion and science, justice and medicine, virtue and vice, crime and punishment, love and wisdom. He was banished for his radical and revolutionary ideas and was executed later for blasphemy. Plato had firm belief in Socrates and keenly observed his debates, dialogues with people around, discussions with other intellectuals in the city of Athens. That exposure formed Plato's ideology, and the influence is noticeable in this and other dialogues. Now let us try to know more about Meno. In this dialogue, Meno is a good-looking and well-born young man. He is a disciple of Gorgias, a prominent sophist and a rhetorician from Greece. The views on virtue expressed by Meno during this dialogue show certain influence of his guru Gorgias. Historically, Meno was a person who was Socrates' primary companion. He stood along with Socrates in the middle of the city of Athens and educated people. Look at this strange and unique way of educating people in those days. He was a prominent Thessalian who constantly visited Athens during the deliberations of ideas. Then the situation changed and Meno was one of the men who brought legal charges against Socrates. Anytus warned him about the trouble he might get into if he did not stop criticizing important people. Despite being intelligent, despite being wise, Meno also got into trouble by criticizing popular figures of those times. Anytus, another participant of this dialogue, was a prominent Athenian statesman who appears as the slave of Meno. In this dialogue, Anytus is a slave who works for Meno. Socrates' dialogue with Anytus put forward the concept of anamnesis. That means certain knowledge is innate and recollected by the soul through proper inquiry. Socrates uses a geometrical example to explain and prove that the soul knows everything in the world. Only we have to realize it. Socrates assures Meno that Anytus can recollect his knowledge and answer the geometrical questions. The question-answer session surprised Meno because Anytus has answered all the questions on geometric figures, length of lines and so on correctly. The dialogue between Meno and Socrates begins abruptly when Meno asks Socrates whether virtue can be taught or not. Meno wants to know how the people claim that they possess virtues. Socrates is surprised with this kind of question and immediately understands that Meno could ask this question since he is influenced by his sophist teacher Gorgias. Socrates suggests that he should first understand the meaning of virtue. Then they can decide whether virtue can be taught or not. Meno first defines virtue and says that virtue is different for men and women, elders and children and so on. That is, virtue differs, or understanding of the term virtue or the concept of virtue, it differs from individual to individual who belong to different age groups. For men, virtue is found in managing public and personal affairs in such a manner that he may be helpful to his friend and harmful to his enemies. For a woman, or for women, the virtue is to serve the husband, look after family matters, to fulfill the requirements of all members of the family without any selfish expectations. Then Meno continues to talk about virtue for children. Socrates interrupts and suggests to him that there cannot be different definitions of one particular concept. A concept should have universal acceptability. Let me simplify it. Virtue cannot be different for all. One particular perspective or concept of virtue should be accepted universally. That is where these three participants disagreed for a long time. The essence of a definition should comprise something that is applied to all in general. Socrates tries to convince Meno with an example from medicine and health. According to Socrates, the nature of virtue remains the same everywhere, but the only change is the way we perceive it. Once Meno makes a comment that the ability to rule over people is a virtue. Immediately Socrates replies and says that no one can limit the definition of virtue to such a narrow perception. The Meno reiterates Socrates' suggestion and says that courage, wisdom, generosity, temperance, etc. are virtues. Both of them continue to speculate over the matter for some time and then try to come to a common understanding. In the subsequent expression, Socrates tells Meno that he has not paid attention to the core of the subject as suggested during the discussion. Socrates feels that Meno still moves around the bush instead of focusing more on the core of it. Virtue can be the good qualities only. Psychologically, human beings do not think of anything negative as virtue. It is because our perceptions of the concept have been influenced by various factors in the course of our cultural development. It means culture also plays a vital role in shaping the definition of virtue. Meno fails to understand how to define virtue, so he is frustrated by Socrates' claim and ultimately admits that he is totally confused in this regard and needs some more counseling over the subject. Meno presents his paradox that no one has really understood the real meaning of the term virtue. Socrates calls this statement as the paradox of inquiry, which is followed by a mathematical example to understand the difference between the two important terms are knowing and not knowing. Knowledge is something that we know. Ignorance cannot be called knowledge. Ignorance keeps an individual away from knowing something. The dialogue between the two continues further. Meno expects that Socrates could enlighten him about the methods of learning. Socrates illustrates the process by introducing the theory of recollection. To make the point clear, Socrates cites an example from a poem that claims that the soul to be immortal and there is nothing that is not learned by the soul in the underworld. Socrates argues that soul is immortal, all powerful, and it knows everything. There is nothing in this world that the soul does not know, but we have to realize it. Meno is convinced with these explanations and illustrations. Then Socrates asks Meno to call his slave Anytus, who joins the dialogue as a participant. Socrates exemplifies geometry, the branch of study which is hardly known to Anytus. Socrates assures Meno that Anytus can recollect his knowledge and answer his questions. The question-answer session surprised Meno because Anytus has answered all the questions on geometric figures, length of lines and so on very correctly. After all, Meno is fully convinced by Socrates that Anytus does not know anything about geometry, and still he has answered all the questions. Meno also agrees with the theory of recollection as a valid one. Then Socrates gives some philosophical implications and two different accounts of the theory of recollection. According to him, the first one is, there is genuine learning when the soul exists prior to birth. Second one, there isn't any genuine learning because the truth about reality is always in the soul. While concluding this topic, Socrates and Meno agree that they will again pursue the definition of virtue and its origin. For Socrates, virtue is a kind of knowledge. If it is knowledge, then it can be learned. Now, both agree that virtue is something which is good and beneficial for people who encounter it. Subsequently, Socrates introduces a new idea that the things known to the soul are beneficial to all and that must be a kind of wisdom. Once again, Anytus participates in the discussion when he is asked whether virtue can be found among politicians. Very interesting question. Anytus tells them about the failure of sophists and parents to teach virtue to their wards. He also adds a comment about the failure of politicians and administrators to exhibit virtue for their citizens. He has contemptuous views about sophists, parents, politicians and administrators. Socrates reminds Anytus that virtue cannot be taught, but Anytus argues and blames Socrates for being harsh towards the people by speaking ill about them. The discussion among the three great participants has heated up. Then Socrates suggests that they should consult an expert who is capable of defining virtue. Towards the end of the dialogue, Meno and Socrates discuss the difference between true opinion and knowledge. Socrates argues that knowledge has stability, whereas true opinion lacks this. Knowledge remains stable because it is based on reason. So, it is very clear, anything that is based on reason is always stable and it is evident. Let us try to recollect. A true opinion is vulnerable, whereas knowledge is stable. From this argument, Socrates concludes his arguments that virtue is good and useful, and similar to true opinion, human being should be virtuous by having the true opinion of virtue and not the mere knowledge of virtue. The themes are also equally interesting. The first theme which we are going to look at is theme of virtue. The theme of virtue is the major theme of the dialogue. Meno begins the dialogue with a question whether virtue can be taught or not. While replying to this question, Socrates gives many illustrations and justifications to convince Meno. Both of them argue over the topic from all perspectives, but Meno could not understand the essence of Socrates' suggestions and moves around the bush. The entire text of the Socratic dialogue moves around the theme of virtue and the possible interpretation of the meaning of virtue in the perspectives of Meno, Socrates and Anytus. The second one is theme of paradox or aporia. The theme of paradox is the recurrent theme of this dialogue. Meno has many doubts in mind which he would like to clarify from Socrates. With the view of gaining more insights on the concept of virtue, he asks Socrates whether virtue can be taught. Such questions arise in the mind of Meno only because he is in a confused state of mind. The mind has become chaotic. Again, in the middle of the dialogue, Meno presents his paradox that no one has really understood the real meaning of the term virtue. Socrates calls this statement a paradox of inquiry. which is followed by a mathematical example to understand the difference between knowing or not knowing. Knowledge is something that we know. Ignorance cannot be called knowledge. Ignorance keeps an individual away from knowing something. Socrates and Meno carry out an exercise together to interpret the concept of virtue and try to discern whether it can really be taught or not. They intend to seek information from other experts. They have their own opinions about it and they always draw their own conclusions. By the end of the dialogue, Socrates, Meno and Anytus arrive at the classic state of Socrates' aporia or perplexity. It is such a state of mind where none of the participants understand the actual meaning of virtue. Ultimately, they realize that they really do not know what virtue is all about. The next theme is theme of recollection and knowledge. Theme of recollection and knowledge is one of the major themes of this dialogue. The dialogue between Meno and Socrates put forward the theory of recollection. Plato personally believed that the soul is immortal and that there is nothing that is not learnt by the soul. Socrates argues that there is nothing in this world that our soul does not know. It knows everything, but we have to realize it. Afterwards, Anytus joins the dialogue as a participant. Socrates exemplifies geometry, the branch of study which is not known to Anytus. Socrates assures Meno that Anytus can recollect his knowledge and answer the questions. The question answer session surprised Meno because Anytus has answered all the questions on geometric figures, length of lines and so on correctly. After all, Meno is fully convinced with Socrates that Anytus does not know anything about geometry. Still, he has answered all the questions. Meno also agrees that the theory of recollection is a valid one. Thus, we have interpreted that Plato has stated knowledge is justified as true belief, and he also added that true belief can be raised to the level of knowledge if it is found with an account of the object of the true belief. Throughout the session, we have seen how great philosophers and thinkers try to understand abstract facets of life. I hope you have enjoyed learning Plato's famous Socratic dialogue, Meno, in which you have studied the concept of virtue. Here, Socrates clarifies the doubts in the mind of Meno, who is unable to come to any conclusion. Socrates attempts to introduce positive ideas about virtue, immortality of the soul, the theory of recollection and knowledge, mathematical justifications and methods of hypothesis, and the distinction between knowledge and belief. Thank you.